Morning, everyone, or Kaya Wanju, as I should say in Wajut. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners in Wajut language. Nala Kajak Wajut Nunga, Mut Kayan Karak Nija Buja. And basically my local country is Wajuk on Noongar land, and I'd like to recognise the continuing connection that community brings to land, water and community, and also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And interestingly, if we'd been doing this 6 months ago, I would have been saying, acknowledging my traditional owners in Gadigal land, but I'm now over in Perth. So, and we've got a dry day, which is amazing. So what an amazing morning, and really rich content and really rich lived experience. And interestingly, when I was looking at supporting Ivan Schwartz in putting this forum together, and we started divvying up who the presenters were going to be and in which order, interestingly, I'm probably covering the topic that's least comfortable for me, because even though I love unpacking barriers, I'm very solution orientated. So I'm always looking for how do we improve, and the advisory side of my brain and the innovative questioning side. But there's been a lot of themes, and I just want to sort of step through a couple of things that will resonate and maybe bring some of the content together, not only from a specific point of view, whether it's from Amber or Sophie or Chris, but also the kind of work that I've been doing over the last, 22 years in Australia, but in particular the last 10 years or so, around trying to ensure that cultures are inclusive, and starting at that very front end around getting the talent right and bringing them in under the right mechanisms. So I'm just going to unpack a couple of considerations, and probably less targeted from the lived experience, but more from a holistic point of view. So my role in I've just joined Western Power about 3 months ago, and I'm their principal consultant for diversity and inclusion. And prior to that, I was consulting across many organizations, up to about 50 clients at a time, really getting under the covers of what's going on in their culture, what are they trying to achieve, not just from a diversity point of view, but from an inclusion point of view. And I've been saying, and Natasha's on this call, and maybe others that know me from the WA side, but I have a lot of repetition in my messaging, things like, the D can be taken care of from a statistical point of view, but the I is neglected, i.e. we can have many multiracial, multicultural representations within an organization, but it doesn't mean to say those people feel included. And inclusion is the act. So if I'm always talking about the difference between diversity being the fact and inclusion being the act, and I wrap it around how do you ensure that people feel included. And the way that I challenge this and agitate in the workplace is to say, you don't have the privilege of deciding whether you're an inclusive person or not. It's how other people feel around you as to whether they see you or experience you as inclusive. So the number of times that I've been in this role, and they go, but I just accept everybody, and I'm really accepting of, and I just think everyone should respect one another. And yet we know that there's plenty of derailers in people's language or their behavior or their attitude, which impacts whether people feel included or not in the workplace. And then, of course, there's a fallout to what happens when you're not included. So one of the things that I talk about a lot in I guess my role is making sure that people understand the difference between the D and the I, but also that it's not a battle of beliefs. It's not about triaging who's more important, raising one group above the other, etc. It's and we all know from our multi-generational representation in the workplace that, particularly now, because there's approximately 5 generations represented in a corporate or a government workplace, which makes it really, really difficult to create a culture that resonates with all of those generations and all of those needs. And hence why we can't, keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And we can't keep saying, the old paradigm was the 40-year plan. You come into work, you fit into our culture. It's a dominant culture, and it's been typically English-speaking, white male created culture. So it was created for men, and men thrive in those cultures. And we've got to unpack all of that and go, where do we create room for others? And it's not just a gendered conversation, but it is about embracing difference and not repelling it. And the minute you get into the conversation about, well, my belief says, or my culture says, or my race, or my ethnicity, or my religion says there's something wrong with this person because they are different or they present different, etc., then we're going to have a really hard time trying to build inclusive cultures. So one thing I encourage all of you to do is, and we've talked a bit about values today, is have a look at what those values are, whether you've inherited them or created them, and bring all the conversation back to the behavior reflecting those values. Because the minute you focus on behavior, you move away from the blame of the individual and the kind of person that's being discriminatory, for instance, or intolerant, or they are using their beliefs to harm others. And the minute you shift it back to behavior and increasing their awareness, reducing the blind spots and the biases, but also coming at it from a safety perspective. So for me, I'm talking a lot about inclusive cultures, but from a psychological safety point of view. And all of us, I can guarantee in this have had challenges around an instance in our life, whether it's at school, at home, at work, where we have felt really threatened and we are not able to be our best self because we're not psychologically safe. And the critical thing is, how do we build that inclusion through action, through behavior? And I've just done the sort of above the line, below the line image there, because people are really clear on what below the line behavior can be, but they're not necessarily sure how to shift into the above the line behavior of inclusivity. So I'm not going to go into many stats because we've had a number of presentations, but it doesn't matter where you start to seek this information, whether it's from the Harvard Business Review, whether it's from Boston Consulting Group, anybody else that you're looking directly into the lens of why would we get diversity and inclusion right? The fact that I've got a job now that has a title that says Principal Consultant of Diversity and Inclusion versus something that was meant to be a facet of HR many, many years ago, the fact that we've now got roles and titles and I guess commitment and investment in this space is because there's an absolute business imperative time and time again. If we don't get this right, our foundations and fabric of organizations are under threat. And the more that we have to demonstrate agility in the workplace, the more we have to respond to innovation. And of course, COVID has completely thrown a spanner in the works in terms of our traditional working styles, our expectations of being present in the workplace, and the needs of people in their personal lives. So we've actually started to unravel those traditional structures of the workplace, which plays heavily into becoming more inclusive and representing the diversity of very underrepresented groups. So, any of these stats will say people that are, embraced from a diversity point of view will demonstrate more innovation, will demonstrate more loyalty, will be higher in their productivity. You as an organization will increase profitability, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a strong business case to why we need to get this right. And yet, and I'm using the inverted commas, the disability disadvantage, because I'm coming back to the very initial discussion around, let's talk about the impairment rather than what's imposed on us. So there's lots of stats. And again, interestingly, I said to Amber before we came on the larger call today that I've pinched some of the Australian Network on Disability stats. But you can use that data to have a conversation, and depending on who your stakeholders are in the workplace, some people will only listen to statistics and other people's journeys. Then that whole FOMO, if they're doing it, why aren't we doing it? Or prove that we need to be doing this. So please use stats to your advantage, and also attach it to the percentage of people in your workplace that potentially are invisible based on those stats, because we know, nearly 20% of our population should be working, and yet 2% of the population are in regards to people with disabilities. So pull out that data. There's a plethora of providers that can support you, but build that into business cases as to why we need to do this, because you will have pushback from some executives and some HR professionals, etc., to say, yes, it might be a nice thing to have, but how's it going to impact our business? And you either need to know your buying style of the person you're talking to, and you either see, well, this is how much it's going to cost if we don't do this. This is what it does to reputational damage. This is the uplift if we do this, etc., etc. So get that business case really tight, I guess. So when we know that there is such a compelling need to get diversity and inclusion, and obviously belonging is the end game, why are we experiencing so many barriers? And I think, Chris, you may have mentioned the word stigma, but if you look at the history of stigma and you look at how it's played out historically in the centuries, but even in our modern world through the Holocaust, for instance, people were stigmatized in a physical way, not just in a verbal and social way as well. So it was seen as a person that was blemished or morally polluted if they were different. And you only have to look at the primal behavior of animals, how we push out anything that's threatening and different. But stigma's real. And the thing that I talk about in the workplace is people seem to see what they want to see. And particularly in the area of disabilities, they can see someone that might be a wheelchair user, or that might have cerebral palsy, or any other physical attribute that looks different to the normative group. And yet, for me, inclusion is building a culture where you don't know who's in that culture, but everybody, invisible or not, feels that they belong. It's not just playing to what's in front of your eyes. And we don't know who's in our cohort in the workplace. We do statistically, but we don't know from a sharing point of view, because if your culture is not inclusive, no one's going to share anything about their situation, whether it's their LGBTQ identity, whether it's a person with disabilities, whether it's their Aboriginality, etc. So what we've got to try and do is tackle the stigma by assuming that everybody is invisible in terms of the underrepresented groups, and building the inclusive culture around. And I talk a lot about the energy of self-edit. So if there's stigma and we're using language that reinforces that stigma, it's going to have an impact on the individual, it's going to have an impact on the team, and it's going to have an impact on your overall micro as well as your macro culture. So, it can be just simple things like, and people to this day don't know what they don't know. And they may even use, inappropriate language like handicapped or spastic, because historically they were words that were used. So it's our job to educate what's more appropriate, what's more inclusive, but also through our behavior as well, we need to make sure that that stigma isn't reinforced. And it's interesting how complicit people are in a harmful culture by not speaking up. And so when you have a high level of fear, or you're in a very permission-based culture, and there's a lot of rules, regulations, or you've got some, fairly technically non-curious kind of employees in the workplace, they're not necessarily going to understand the ambiguity and the breadth of diversity, and therefore the need for inclusive behavior. But I think when you look at some of the statistics of what's happening to anybody that's underrepresented in the workplace, it's the impact of that self-energy and that flooding of cortisol and that fight and flight state that you're in the minute you hear or see something that talks to your identity. And if you look at the overall impact, and this is where you flip this business model on its head from a positive point of view, but if you look at what falls out of non-inclusion, it's poor team cohesion, because you're not feeling like you belong. Your personal health and well-being is compromised. You're not going to be engaged. Your personal safety and the duty of care of your organization is being breached. Never mind laws and acts that now protect anybody with a disability. You're not going to feel that you want to produce more than you have to. Chances are you're going to self-select out of the organization, which then is going to impact the pipeline, the reputation, and the brand of the organization. So the minute you flip that on its head and say, this is why we need to do this, that argument's really compelling, and it will get the naysayers and the uneducated power brokers and influencers in your business listening again. Yeah. So, and because we flipped around some of the order this morning, my slides were potentially going to lead into Sophie's. So I'm not going to labor too much on the last few slides, but I'm a big fan of intersectionality. And again, people will hear me talk about intersectionality and allyship all the time. And it can talk about intersectionality of privilege as well as a lack of privilege and discrimination. And when you see things like the privilege walk and how that manifests and the kind of questions you can ask in that privilege walk, and if you haven't seen the privilege walk, there's lots of examples, but have a look on YouTube. If it's conducted in a safe way in the workplace, it can really give people that critical aha moment around, wow, I thought we were all the same because we're in the same team, we've got the same level of pay, we are a particular level of leadership. And yet when you look at the gap that appears based on what people have to overcome and face on a daily basis, and again, that invisible discrimination that's going on, people can shift and can move towards an awareness and therefore a more inclusive kind of culture and behavior. But we're not one dimensional. I think Sophie was talking about that. You know, I was just with some young Aboriginal teenagers yesterday in Geraldton. And, you know, you talk about they've got not only their Aboriginal identity, but they're women as well. But then they're also carers at home. And then add any other layer around literacy, numeracy, socioeconomic, et cetera, you're building a very high impact level of barriers in someone's life. And it's how do we consider those adjustments so that everyone can belong. And you will get people saying, well, we're lowering the bar and we're cheating and making it easier for people to come in. To a degree we are, because we're trying to reduce those barriers. But the difference is around making them just as important, not more important in the workplace. And that's a conversation that's often lost with people. And intersectionality really helps demonstrate where those day-to-day barriers are, whether they're visible or not. So I'm not going to labor any of these points to a degree, but it just gives you a flavor of what we've been talking about, not just from a targeted point of view, but a holistic point of view. And it is a lot around policies changing and understanding and education around what you should be doing now versus what you have been doing, which potentially can get you into even more hot water if you don't adjust those workplace practices. And if you're in an organization like Western Power, for instance, we've got 3,000 staff. So, and some of them are spread all over the region. And, you know, when I first joined, they said our territory is the size of the UK, which gives me a really visual understanding of the work I've got to do, but also where I've got to influence through my collegiate network. And so it is about those bite-sized pieces, and using things like the index that Amber talked about will help you divvy up who can start to own some of these changes rather than it burden you as either a D&I professional or someone with lived experience in an organization that's tasked with getting this stuff right. So from an organizational point of view, this is where you want to build that awareness, and education is key. And being a former teacher, I'm very attached to the power of education and the power of language, and lead by example, but also make it safe so people can start to share. And the more we bring visibility to the conversation and the lived experience, the more we normalize the embracing of people and workers with disabilities, but also showing the organizations how we can get this right. So assisting on that new journey for change, yeah, rather than just throwing a policy at them. So when you think about people that come to work with a disability, there's always this assumption that it's going to be a lesser experience, or they're going to be producing lesser outputs, which of course is a complete furphy. And we know that anybody from an underrepresented group, whether again it's from LGBTQ, whether it's from the COLD community, people with disabilities, from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander point of view, etc., you will get higher levels of engagement, productivity, loyalty, etc. And so, you know, there is no reason why we shouldn't be getting this right. And the best thing about forums like this is connecting with people that you didn't know were out there, but also sharing your own challenges and how somebody can overcome that conversation with you in the workplace, because that's the hardest part. Where do you start? And Chris mentioned, being totally overwhelmed, getting the ICANN network up, and yet, what an amazing outcome in terms of lived experience representation, but also reaching out to everyone through that NDIS network. So that's really my take on all of it. And then I guess my challenge is, so what can you do? I just want to refer you to the image that I use as well. So Catalyst Consulting was my previous consulting business before I joined Western Power, but this photograph is taken in the Grand Canyon, and it was day 3, and we rafted the Grand Canyon with 16 people in 2011, and we were all on huge inflatable rafts, and we couldn't get down from the top in the 16 days unless we had really cohesive teamwork. We were a whole group of people that didn't know each other, but we were handpicked by the husband and wife team that coordinated the whole trip. And I've never seen people, and I've never seen a demonstration of difference come together under quite risky circumstances, in this case, going over these grade 10 rapids on the Grand Canyon. And so this picture here is one of my favorite pictures of the whole trip, where we are all interconnected and we're all supporting each other and we're keeping each other up, and yet we're all so different. And we had, and I talk a lot about the sum of the parts rather than the parts. And we're very guilty in the workplace of always looking at the gaps and filling those gaps of individual jobs and looking at the jobs rather than the family. And if we look at the cohort and the sum of the parts, we then can fire at a different level than we are if we're just individuals in a independent stream of work, rather than how do we build a really tight core. So that's me, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and thanks a lot for dialing in.